I was alone in my truck on KY 421 south of Barberville at 5:40 in the morning, the engine idling, a GPS unit on the dash blinking as I logged wetland boundary waypoints for the environmental firm that contracted me. The cab was cold enough that my breath fogged the windshield. I wiped it with my sleeve and went back to the unit. I marked the third waypoint of the morning and noted the coordinates in a spiral field notebook on the passenger seat. The work was methodical and solitary, the kind of work I took after leaving SAR because it asked nothing of me except accuracy. I liked the quiet. I liked the dark. I liked that I could do the job and go home and no one asked me questions about why I'd left the other one. My phone, face up on the dash, lit up with an incoming call. The screen read, Ruth Gaines. I looked at it for 2 full rings before I picked up. "Harrison," Audrey Washington said. She didn't ask how I was. 3 cavers entered a cave system on the Robertson farm outside Flat Lick 6 days ago. They haven't come out. I didn't say anything. I waited. A Knox County Sheriff's deputy ran the cave against the state karst registry and the Kentucky Geological Survey records. Nothing. No permit, no survey file, no documentation of any kind. The cave doesn't officially exist. I wrote the word Robertson in the margin of the field notebook. The landowner, Benny Robertson, reported them to the county after waiting 2 days past the group's stated return time. Knox County has no trained cave rescue personnel. The nearest KSP cave rescue unit is in Lexington and hasn't been formally requested yet. I capped my pen. "I'm not SAR anymore," I said. "I know," Audrey said. Then she told me the lead caver's name was Joshua Garza and that he still carried my name and phone number on an index card in his wallet as his emergency contact. I didn't respond to that. The windshield was fogging again and I didn't wipe it. I looked at the notebook in my lap and at the 3 waypoints I'd marked and at the 10 more I was supposed to log before noon. "I'll drive to the property and look at the entrance," I said. "That's all I'm saying." I ended the call. I set the phone down, capped the field notebook, and pulled a U-turn on KY 421. I hadn't spoken to Joshua in 3 years. The last time we spoke, it ended with him telling me he could run his own life. I didn't argue with him then, and I wasn't planning to argue with him now. But Audrey had called me, and Joshua's name was still on that card in his wallet, and I didn't know what that meant except that I was driving east toward Flat Lick with the GPS unit still blinking on the dash with the morning's unfinished waypoints. I turned off KY 718 onto a gravel county road that barely had room for 1 vehicle, and drove until the trees opened up on a derelict tobacco farm. A collapsed barn sat to the left of the drive. The roof caved in and the walls splayed out like a broken rib cage. The farmhouse was set back from the road, the windows boarded over with plywood that had gone gray from weather. The pasture beyond it hadn't been worked in years. Cedar scrub had taken the fence lines, and the grass was tall enough to hide whatever was underneath it. Nothing about it looked like a place with a cave entrance. I parked and got out. The light was going fast now, the sky purple-gray above the tree line. I walked into the pasture with my headlamp in my hand, not turned on yet, and found what I was looking for in the center of the field. The sinkhole was about 30 feet across, ringed with rebar stakes driven into the ground at intervals and strung with orange perimeter rope. The rope was new, bright orange, not faded or frayed, and it was the kind cavers used for marking. 3 sets of boot tracks led to the lip of the depression and stopped. They didn't come back. I looked at the tracks and then at the sinkhole and felt the weight of the call I'd gotten that morning settle in my chest like a stone. A voice called out from behind me, "You Garza's brother?" I turned. A man in his late 60s was standing at the fence line, maybe 50 feet back from where I stood. He was wearing work clothes, canvas pants, a flannel shirt, and his hands were at his sides. He wasn't moving toward me. He was waiting for me to come to him. I walked back to the fence. "Harrison Garza," I said, "Joshua's brother." He nodded once, slow, like he'd been expecting me. "Benny Robertson," he said. "This is my land." I asked him what he knew about the cave. Benny looked past me toward the sinkhole and didn't answer right away. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, like he was saying something he'd been holding back for days. My father sealed the entrance in '87, he said. 2 farmhands went in together. Only one came back. He stopped there, like that was the end of the story. What happened to the one who came back? I asked. He never said, Benny said. Stopped speaking almost entirely. Stayed that way the rest of his life. I felt the cold air coming up from the sinkhole behind me and didn't turn around. Why'd you let my brother's group in? I said. Benny's jaw worked for a second before he answered. Joshua showed me a map, he said. Made it look like a standard passage. Offered me $200 for access. I needed the money. And I thought my father had been superstitious. He said that last part like he was trying to convince himself it had been reasonable at the time. I asked him what his father had actually said about the cave. Benny turned and walked to his truck without answering. He opened the passenger door and pulled out an old composition notebook with a water-stained cover. He came back to the fence and held it in both hands, not offering it to me. You want to know what he said? Benny said. I'll read it to you. He opened the notebook and flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. His voice was flat when he read it, like he was reading a weather report and not something that had kept him awake for 30 years. Something in the cave is old enough that it no longer needs eyes. It finds you not by sight or sound alone, but by what you feel, by the vibration of fear and heartbeat moving through the stone. He closed the notebook and held it out to me. I should not have opened that entrance, he said. He turned and walked to the farmhouse. I heard the door close and the deadbolt slide home. The porch light didn't come on. I stood there with the notebook in my hand and the sinkhole at my back and the sky going dark overhead. Then I walked back to my truck and turned on the headlamp. The notebook was filled with entries in tight, slanted handwriting. The dates ran from 1985 through '87. Harlan Robertson had written about the cave like it was something the farm had been built over without anyone knowing what was underneath. He described attempts to map the passages and finding walls that didn't make sense, chambers that opened up where the geology said they shouldn't. He wrote about the 2 farmhands who went in and the one who came back and never spoke again. The final entries were about sealing the entrance, poured concrete and rebar, a decision never to file anything with the county because filing would require explaining, and explaining would require admitting he didn't know what he'd found. I turned off the headlamp and sat in the dark cab with the notebook on my knee. I could see the farmhouse across the pasture, the windows boarded and lightless. Benny wasn't coming back out. I opened the truck bed and pulled out the Pelican case I kept behind the seats. Full cave kit. Headlamp with 2 spare batteries, 50 meters of 9mm static rope, a rappel rack, ascenders, a harness, a dry bag, a first aid kit, and 2 liters of water. I'd kept it stocked for survey work. Wetland sites sometimes required descents into sinkholes to check for aquifer connections, but I hadn't used it in 6 months. I checked every piece of it. The batteries were good, the rope wasn't frayed, the ascenders locked clean. I added a second headlamp from the cab and an extra set of batteries from the glove box. Then I sat in the driver's seat with the door open and read the notebook a second time. Harlan's handwriting got tighter toward the end, the lines closer together, like he was running out of space or time or both. He described the sealing process in detail, how deep they poured the concrete, how they anchored the rebar, how they covered it over with soil and rock and let the pasture grow back over it. He wrote that he believed the thing in the cave knew the entrance had been sealed. He wrote that he didn't think it minded. I stopped reading before I got to the last page. I didn't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to know what Harlan Robertson had written at the very end, after everything else was done. I closed the notebook and set it on the passenger seat. The farmhouse was still dark. The sinkhole was a black circle in the pasture, the orange rope barely visible in the starlight. I sat in the dark cab with the notebook on my knee and the farmhouse locked and dark across the pasture, and waited for first light. I rigged the anchor at first light. The rebar stakes Benny's group had set were still solid, driven deep enough to hold. I clipped the rope through the rack, checked the harness twice, and backed over the lip of the sinkhole without looking at the farmhouse. The curtains didn't move. Nobody was watching. The drop was clean and vertical, about 60 feet straight down. The rope ran smooth through the rack, and I touched gravel at the bottom in under a minute. I unclipped and turned in place, letting my headlamp sweep the chamber. Classic Eastern Kentucky karst. Horizontal passages with low ceilings, rimstone pools catching the light in the upper sections, the smell of cold mineral water. It was completely silent. No drip, no air movement. My headlamp carried about 15 feet before the dark swallowed it. I moved forward, keeping my steps quiet out of habit. The passage opened into a larger chamber roughly 40 meters from the base of the shaft, and that's where I found their gear. 3 expedition packs lined up against the left wall, a spare rope bag, a rack of bolts and hangers hung on a natural hook in the stone, a small camp stove with the fuel canister still attached, set upright on a flat shelf of rock. Everything was organized, nothing scattered, nothing dropped in a hurry. They had staged it like a cache they were planning to come back to. I knelt beside the first pack and checked the top pocket. Joshua's handwriting was on the tag. I pulled the logbook out and opened it. The first day's entries were what I expected. Standard karst traverse. Tight passages, rimstone pools, a climb down a breakdown slope into a lower level. Joshua's handwriting was neat and methodical, every entry timed and measured. 15 years of caving habits on the page. I could hear his voice in the way he wrote it. The second day was different. He described the passages opening into chambers with no formations, no stalactites, no flowstone, no speleothems of any kind, just smooth, dark limestone walls. He wrote that it was geologically anomalous, and that it didn't match any formation type he'd encountered in 15 years of caving in the region. Then he described marks on the walls, circular depressions, each roughly the diameter of a spread hand, covering the walls at irregular intervals. He wrote that the marks appeared to have been pressed from behind the stone, as if something on the other side had braced its palm flat against the rock and held it there long enough to leave an impression. The final entry was short. Chase knocked on one of the marked walls as a test. Something on the other side knocked back, going deeper to find the source. That was it. No timestamp on the last line. No note about when they planned to return. I closed the logbook and put it in my chest pocket. Then I shouldered my pack and picked up the survey tape Joshua's group had left as a trail line. It ran from the gear cache into a passage at the back of the chamber, the orange tape bright against the dark stone. I followed it into the lower passages, the gear cache and the entrance shaft behind me, the logbook pressing against my ribs with every step. The trail line led me down. 2 hours of crawling through tighter and tighter passages, the ceiling pressing lower every few hundred feet, the walls squeezing in until some of the slots were barely wide enough to get my shoulders through. I kept one hand on the orange tape and moved through the dark, my headlamp carving out a narrow cone of light in front of me. The first hour was standard karst, low ceilings and gravel floors and the smell of cold mineral water. My knees started to ache after the first 30 minutes of crawling. After an hour, I had to lie flat and pull myself through a slot that couldn't have been more than 18 inches high, the stone pressing down on my back and my chest scraping the floor. I thought about Joshua coming through here 6 days ago, thought about him pulling himself through this same slot with his pack and his gear, and I kept moving. The cold got worse the deeper I went. I could feel it through my gloves, through the knees of my work pants, through the thermal layer under my jacket. The kind of cold that doesn't just sit on your skin but works its way in, settling into your joints and your lungs. I switched to my second headlamp when the first one started to dim, the battery draining faster than it should have in the cold. I pocketed the first lamp to let it recover and kept going. The trail line ran ahead of me through passage after passage, always leading down. Then the cave changed. The karst formations stopped. No more rimstone pools, no flowstone, no stalactites hanging from the ceiling. Just smooth, dark walls that didn't look like the rest of the cave. The color was different, darker, almost black in places, and the surface looked compressed instead of dissolved, like something had pressed the stone flat over a very long time. It looked older than everything above it. I stopped at the threshold and ran my hand along the wall. The stone was cold and smooth under my palm. I thought about Joshua's logbook, about the line that said the formation didn't match anything he'd seen in 15 years of caving in the region. He was right. This wasn't karst. I didn't know what it was. The trail line led me into the first of the smooth-walled chambers. My headlamp swept across the walls and I saw the depressions Joshua had written about. Circular marks, each one the size of a spread hand, covering the walls at irregular intervals. Some near the floor, some near the ceiling, some in between. No pattern to the placement, just scattered across every surface like something had moved through the room without caring which way was up or down. I counted 43 depressions in the first chamber alone. The second chamber had more. The third had even more than that. They covered every wall, every surface, clustered thick in some places and sparse in others. I stopped in the middle of the third chamber and just stood there, turning slowly, letting my headlamp trace across the walls. Hundreds of them, maybe more. I walked to the nearest wall and found a depression at shoulder height. I pressed my palm flat into it. The fit was exact. My hand filled the mark perfectly, my fingers matching the width, my palm fitting the depth. The stone was solid under my hand. No hollow sound when I pressed, no give. Whatever made this mark had done it with sustained pressure, not a strike. Something had pressed its hand flat against the wall and held it there long enough to leave an impression in solid limestone. I pulled my hand back and looked at the mark again. Then I looked at all the others, scattered across the walls around me, and I thought about what it meant that something had touched every surface in this room. That was when I heard the sound. A slow, rhythmic striking, stone on stone, 4 seconds between each strike, steady and deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the cave. I stood still and listened. The sound didn't speed up or slow down. It just kept going, one strike every 4 seconds like a clock ticking in the dark. I listened to it for a full minute, counting the strikes, and it never varied. 16 strikes, 16 perfect intervals. Then I started moving again. The trail line led me to the back of the third chamber, where a diagonal slot cut through the wall at an angle. I had to turn sideways to fit, my chest pressed against one side and my back against the other, shuffling through the squeeze with my pack scraping stone on both sides. I came out into a large chamber. My headlamp didn't reach the ceiling. The beam just disappeared into the black above me, swallowed by the dark. The rhythmic striking was louder here, clearer, and it was coming from somewhere ahead. I stood at the entrance and let my headlamp cut into the chamber, the light reaching maybe 20 feet before it faded. The striking continued in the dark beyond. 4 seconds, strike, 4 seconds, strike. I didn't move. I just stood there, my hand on the wall beside me, and listened to the sound echoing through the chamber ahead. I moved across the chamber in a crouch, keeping my weight on the balls of my feet, trying to make each step as light as possible. My headlamp cut through the dark in a narrow cone, the beam reaching maybe 20 feet before it gave up. The light found Joshua in the center of the chamber. He was sitting upright against a stalagmite, the only formation I'd seen since entering the smooth-walled section. His wrists were zip-tied in front of him with what looked like one of his own gear ties. His eyes were open. He was looking right at me. He didn't look relieved. His face was locked down, controlled, like he was holding something back by force of will. "Do not make a sound," he whispered. "It is in the chamber with us." I stopped moving. My hand went to the knife on my belt, but I didn't pull it yet. I scanned the chamber without stepping away from the squeeze entrance, sweeping the headlamp left and right. The beam found Cindy Buck against the left wall, maybe 15 feet from Joshua. She was sitting with her arms around her knees, her head down, completely still. I moved the light further and found Chase Howell against the right wall, also sitting, his left leg stretched out straight in front of him at an angle that looked wrong. He wasn't moving either. I brought the light back toward the center of the chamber, trying to make sense of the space, and that's when I saw it. At the far edge of the beam, something moved out of the light before I could get a clear look at it. Pale, large, moving along the wall instead of across the floor, its limbs working in a way that didn't look human. And then it was gone, swallowed by the dark beyond the headlamp's reach. I forced myself to breathe slow and even. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I moved toward Joshua, staying low, placing each boot carefully on the stone. The chamber was silent except for the faint scrape of my jacket against rock. I reached him and knelt down, pulling the knife from my belt. He held his wrists up without a word. I cut the zip tie in one stroke. He worked his hands apart slowly, flexing his fingers, making no sound. I leaned in close. "What is it?" Joshua's mouth was right next to my ear when he answered, his voice barely more than breath. "Blind. No eyes. It moves by vibration through the stone. Footsteps. Heartbeat. If you're close enough, it can feel you breathing." I looked at the dark beyond my headlamp. "How long?" 6 days. 6 days. I looked at Cindy and Chase again, both of them sitting perfectly still against the walls like statues. 6 days in the dark with that thing moving around them. "Why didn't it kill you?" Joshua's jaw tightened. "It didn't want us dead. It wanted us still. When Chase tried to crawl out 3 days ago, it dragged him back. Didn't hurt him. Just put him against the wall and held him there until he stopped moving. Then it let go." "Why?" "The knocking," Joshua said. "When Chase knocked on the wall out there and it knocked back, I think that was the first time anything had answered it. I think it has been alone in here for a very long time." The words landed cold in my chest. I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant, but before I could say anything, the rhythmic striking started again. Closer this time. 4 seconds of silence, then a slow, deliberate strike against stone, the sound carrying through the chamber like a hammer on an anvil. 4 more seconds. Another strike. Joshua and I both went still. My headlamp began to flicker. The light died for half a second, plunging us into total black, and then came back, dimmer now, the beam narrower. The cold down here was draining the battery faster than it should have. I'd been underground for hours. The temperature had to be below 45 degrees. The light flickered again, died, came back. And in that dying, reviving light, I saw it. The creature was 15 feet away, pressed flat against the wall to my right. It was pale, hairless, larger than a person, with long limbs that looked too thin for its body and a torso that seemed compressed, like it had been built for squeezing through tight spaces. Its fingers were spread wide against the stone, each one as long as my forearm. Its face was smooth, no eye sockets, no nose, just a pale, featureless surface with a mouth that hung slightly open, the lips parted like it was tasting the air. Its head was angled toward us. The light flickered again, and for a moment the creature disappeared into the black. When the beam came back, it was still there, motionless, its spread hands flat against the wall. The rhythmic striking stopped. Joshua and I didn't move. We barely breathed. The chamber was silent except for the faint hum of my failing headlamp and the slow, even sound of the creature breathing through its open mouth. It stayed where it was, its head tilted toward us, waiting. I needed to move. The creature was 15 feet away, and my headlamp was dying. I had maybe seconds before the light failed completely, and we were all in the dark with something that could navigate by heartbeat alone. I bent down and grabbed a piece of breakdown rock from the chamber floor. The stone was smooth, fist-sized, cold against my palm. I tapped it twice against the wall beside me. The sound carried clean through the chamber, sharp, deliberate. The creature's head turned away from Joshua and toward me. I knocked 3 more times, slower, letting each one hang in the air. The creature moved, not fast, not aggressive, but deliberate, its head tilting as it tracked the sound, its long fingers sliding across the stone as it came closer. I held up 2 fingers and pointed at the squeeze behind us. Joshua saw it. He moved. He got to Cindy first, touching her shoulder once. She rose without a sound. 6 days of sitting still had taught her exactly how to move. She crossed the chamber floor like water, her boots barely touching stone. Chase was harder. Joshua knelt beside him and got a hand under his arm. Chase's left leg wouldn't bend. It stayed locked, the knee rigid from sitting in one position too long. Joshua got Chase's arm over his shoulder and lifted. Chase bit down on whatever sound wanted to come out and didn't make one. I kept the creature's attention. I knocked on the wall to my left, 3 times. The creature turned and moved toward the new sound, its spread hands reading the surface as it arrived. I knocked on the floor, twice. It lowered its head, tracking downward. I knocked above my head, reaching high, and it followed the sound upward again, moving with the same unhurried patience. It wasn't hunting, it was listening. Cindy reached the squeeze and slipped through without hesitation. Joshua was at the slot now, feeding Chase through sideways. Chase's bad leg made it slow. He had to twist to get his hips through the narrow opening, and the locked knee caught once on the stone lip. He didn't make a sound. I backed toward the squeeze, still knocking. Left wall, floor, right wall. The creature followed each sound, reorienting, its head angled toward me as I moved. It closed the distance to 2 feet and stopped. I could hear it breathing, slow, even, through the parted mouth. I could see the slight rise and fall of its chest, compressed and pale, built for moving through spaces too tight for anything else. The creature raised its right hand and pressed its palm flat against the wall beside where I'd been knocking. It held it there, waiting. Joshua and the others were through. I could hear them moving in the passage beyond the squeeze, the faint scrape of boots on stone. I was alone in the chamber with it now. I pressed my own palm flat against the wall beside the creature's hand. The stone was cold, solid. I held it there. The creature didn't move. Its breathing stayed the same, slow, steady, not a threat, just presence. I lifted my hand and backed toward the squeeze. The creature stayed where it was, its palm still pressed to the wall, its head angled toward the space where I'd been standing. I turned sideways and slid through the slot, stone scraping against my pack and my shoulders. My headlamp flickered once as I cleared the narrow opening, and then I was through, into the smooth-walled passage on the other side. Behind me, in the chamber, the rhythmic striking began again, stone on stone, the same tempo as when I'd arrived, the same patient interval. Not pursuit, continuation. I led them back through the smooth-walled chambers at whatever pace Chase could manage. He had one good leg and one arm draped over Joshua's shoulder, the 2 of them moving together in an awkward shuffle. Cindy carried both packs, hers and Chase's, without complaint. The circular depressions passed on either side in my headlamp beam, more than 40 in the first chamber alone. They pressed out of the darkness and fell back into it as we moved. I didn't look at them. I kept my attention on the trail line and on Chase's uneven breathing behind me. We entered the low crawl section, the last passage before the entrance chamber. 20 meters of flat stone ceiling and hard floor, the kind of crawl where your pack scrapes the top and your knees take the damage. I went first to check the line, then dropped back to the rear position. Chase went ahead of me, moving on his elbows, his bad leg dragging behind him like dead weight. His breathing was labored. 6 days without food had hollowed him out. I could hear it in every exhale, thin, ragged, barely enough to keep him moving. But he kept going. He didn't stop. Then his knee hit the shelf. A sharp crack, stone on stone. The sound carried through the passage like a gunshot in a closed room. Chase froze. Cindy froze ahead of him. Joshua froze. I froze. Behind us, the rhythmic striking stopped. Then we heard it. Movement in the deep passage, fast, fluid. The sound of something covering stone at speed. Not the slow, deliberate movement from the chamber. Something different. Reactive. It was coming through the smooth-walled chambers toward the crawl. I shoved Cindy's boot. Go. Don't stop. She moved, no hesitation. She'd spent 6 days learning how to be still, and she knew exactly when stillness would get you killed. I grabbed Joshua's shoulder and set it low and fast. Take Chase and climb. Get to the rope and go up. Do not wait for me. Joshua looked at me for 1 second. His face was unreadable in the faint backwash of my headlamp. He didn't argue. He got Chase moving. I turned and braced in the crawl passage with my back against the upper wall and my boots against the lower, blocking the slot. The stone was cold through my jacket. I pressed harder and felt the vibration of the creature's movement through the rock under my palms. It was moving fast through the smooth-walled chambers, covering distance, coming for the source of the sound. I spread my weight across the walls and waited. The vibration stopped. The creature was at the constriction, 4 feet below my boots. I could hear it breathing, the same slow, even breath from the chamber, unchanged even at speed, in and out, patient, deliberate. I felt it press against the narrowing. The passage was too tight for its size. The stone held. It couldn't get through. I counted the seconds by its breath. 1, 2, 3. I got to 30 before the vibration shifted. Then it retreated. Back toward the smooth-walled chambers. Back toward the deep passage. The vibration diminished under my hands until I couldn't feel it in the stone anymore. I climbed out of the crawl and moved to the entrance chamber. My hands were shaking. I clipped my ascenders to the rope and started up the 60-foot shaft. 1 pull. Another. The ascenders bit into the rope and held. My arms burned. I kept climbing. I came out of the sinkhole into thin morning light. Cold air hit my face. The sky was pale gray, the kind of gray that comes just after dawn. I sat on the lip of the sinkhole for a moment before I could stand. My arms were shaking. The rope still hung into the dark below me. Joshua was at the top. He grabbed my arm when I cleared the lip and didn't let go. We stood there at the edge of the pasture, cold morning light washing everything flat and gray, and neither of us said anything. 3 years of silence sat between us like a third person, but neither of us acknowledged it. Cindy was sitting on the ground 10 feet away, her back against a cedar post, eyes closed. She hadn't spoken since we came out. Chase was on his back in the grass, his left leg straight out in front of him. He was conscious, but he looked like someone who'd been underground for 6 days without food. He couldn't stand without help. I let go of Joshua's arm and pulled out my phone. It took 2 rings. Audrey. We're out, I said. All 3 alive. 1 needs immediate medical attention. There was a pause. Then, I'm listening. I gave her the farm address on KY 718. She said she'd be there in 40 minutes and hung up before I could say anything else. The farmhouse door opened. Benny Robertson came out onto the porch, still wearing the same work clothes from the night before. He looked at the four of us, then at the sinkhole, and didn't ask questions. I walked over to the fence line. "The entrance needs to be sealed permanently, properly today," I said. Benny nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't say anything about the $200 Joshua had paid him, or his father's notebook, or the fact that he'd opened something that should have stayed closed. He just nodded and went back inside. Joshua and I sat on the tailgate of my truck and waited. The sun was up now, but it wasn't warm yet. The pasture was quiet except for the wind moving through the cedar scrub along the fence line. Joshua didn't look at me when he spoke. "Why did you block me from joining the SAR team?" he said. "That's what started all of this between us. I want to know the actual reason." I looked at the sinkhole. The rope was still hanging into it, disappearing into the dark. "There was a colleague," I said, 2 years ago. Limestone cave dive in Pulaski County. He drowned." Joshua waited. "He made an error," I said, "in the approach. I saw it developing and I didn't stop it. I let it happen." The wind picked up. I felt it against my face. "The inquest ruled it an accident," I said. "I didn't correct that finding." Joshua turned his head slightly but still didn't look at me. "I've known for 2 years that I bear part of that death," I said. "I blocked you from SR because I didn't trust myself to keep you safe. And I didn't know how to say that without saying everything else." Joshua was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "You could have just told me that." He didn't say anything more. We sat there until we heard the sound of a truck coming up the gravel drive. Audrey's Ford pulled into the pasture and stopped near the sinkhole. She got out with a first responder kit and walked straight to Chase without saying anything to me. She knelt beside him and opened the kit. I watched her check his pulse, look at his eyes, ask him questions I couldn't hear. Chase answered in a low voice. Audrey pulled out her phone and made a call. "This is Audrey Washington. I need an ambulance at the Robertson Farm, County Road off KY 718, east of Flat Lick. One patient, male, mid-30s, severe dehydration, malnourishment, possible joint injury. No, he's conscious. 40 minutes. She hung up and moved to Cindy. She took Cindy's vitals, gave her a bottle of water, and wrapped an emergency blanket around her shoulders. Cindy took the water but didn't open her eyes. Audrey came over to me. She looked at the sinkhole, then at me. "What's in there?" she said. "Something that stays in there," I said. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded. She didn't ask again. The ambulance took longer than 40 minutes. When it finally arrived, 2 paramedics got Chase onto a stretcher and loaded him into the back. Cindy walked to the ambulance on her own. Audrey followed in her truck. Joshua stood beside the ambulance door for a moment, looking back at me. Neither of us said anything. He got in. The ambulance pulled down the gravel drive, Audrey's truck behind it. I watched them turn onto KY 718 and disappear. Then it was just me and Benny Robertson, alone in the pasture with the open sinkhole. We worked on the entrance until it was done. Benny had a steel plate in his barn, 1/2 an inch thick, rusted along the edges but solid. We dragged it out to the pasture and cut it to size with an angle grinder he'd pulled from somewhere in the back of the structure. The noise was loud enough that I kept glancing toward the sealed sinkhole, but nothing moved and nothing answered. We set the plate over the opening and drilled through into the limestone lip, then drove rebar straight down through the holes into the rock. Benny mixed the concrete in a wheelbarrow he'd filled from a 50-pound bag, adding water from a hose that ran all the way out from the side of the barn. We poured it thick around the anchor points, 2 feet deep where the rebar met stone. Neither of us spoke much. Benny worked steady and methodical, the way a man works when he's been doing farm repair for 40 years. I matched his pace. We didn't need to discuss what we were doing or why. When the concrete had set enough to hold, I stood over the sealed plate and looked at it. The orange rope was still looped around the perimeter stakes. I pulled each stake free and coiled the rope into a loose bundle and set it on the ground beside the sinkhole. The plate sat flush with the pasture floor now, a dark square of steel in the pale grass. I walked back to my truck and opened the cab. Harlan Robertson's notebook was on the passenger seat where I'd left it. I picked it up and turned to the last page. I'd read most of it the night before, but not the final entry. Harlan had written that he believed the creature knew the entrance had been sealed. He wrote that he did not think it minded. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, each line straight across the page. It has been waiting for something to answer the knocking for longer than this farm has existed. It will wait longer still. I closed the notebook. The binding was cracked and the pages were brittle along the edges. I carried it to the farmhouse porch and set it down on the top step, against the door frame where Benny would see it. I didn't take it with me. Benny was still standing by the sinkhole when I walked back to the truck. He had his hands in his pockets and his head down, looking at the sealed plate. I stopped beside him for a moment. "It's done," I said. He nodded. He didn't look at me. I got in the truck and started the engine. The GPS unit was still mounted on the dash, the screen lit with the unfinished waypoints from the morning before. Little blue markers scattered across the grid, blinking in sequence. I put the truck in gear and drove down the gravel drive toward KY 718. The pasture receded in the rearview mirror, the sealed steel plate just visible in the grass, and then the trees took it and I couldn't see it anymore. I kept driving west toward Barberville. The road was narrow and empty. The GPS kept blinking. I didn't look back.